So we're joined now by George Pepu, who is the CEO and founder of Australia's Val. George, thanks for joining us. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on the show. First, let's start with the background of Val and the state of cultivated meat today. So what personal experience or observation initially sparked your interest in the future of food and the creation of Val?
So I've worked my whole career really in food and food innovation in particular. Going way back, I worked as a chef while I studied a biochemistry degree and then jumped around a whole bunch of roles until now about 6 or 7 years ago when I formed a view that in order to change our food system for the better, the best way to do that is not to try to change the incumbent companies, but to build new businesses which integrate sustainability at their very core. And so rather than founding Val at that point, I started a startup accelerator focused on ag and food tech companies. So specifically in this sort of food chain space. And through that, no matter how you look at it, protein production is this massive resource bottleneck in our food system. And I didn't see anyone solving it in a way that I believed in. So I sort of looked across all the different technical solutions, and plant-based or plant-based with precision fermentation just don't get you close enough to the biochemical complexity of meat that seems to be really important, both for the sensory experience and the nutrition. And so that really left cell culture as the only way that gets you anywhere near the biochemical complexity of animal tissue with a small physical and environmental footprint. And so that sort of led me to the world of cultured meat or cultivated meat. And then within that space, I looked around, spent a lot of time looking around at all the different companies and their approaches. And everyone was, and largely still is, focused on replicating the meats that we have today. And as someone that eats meat regularly, it just didn't really make sense to me to walk into a supermarket in a hypothetical future and buy a different version of a chicken breast or a different version of beef mince. It feels like a really hard behavior change to create and sustain. And what I believed is if I could walk in and buy something that's better than the meat that I eat today, tastier, more nutritious, more convenient, more cost effective, offering extra functions, that then becomes a really appealing proposition for me, as opposed to a like-for-like substitution. And no one seemed to be working on that problem. No one seemed to be setting out to invent food that we can't currently get. It was all about making the food we can have now in different ways.
So you created Val, so you could just describe some of the challenges that you faced in launching the company and how you overcame those.
All of them is the short answer. So right at the very beginning, very basic things like getting a lab space, finding people that want to work on something this bold and this risky, especially somewhere like Australia, which doesn't have the risk tolerance of the Bay Area, was definitely a big challenge. Beyond that, setting up a supply chain, once you sort of solve the first handful of technical problems and you move into scale up, setting up a supply chain and realizing that the pharmaceutical supply chain, which exists for large scale cell culture, is just not suited to food, both in its cost structure, and in its sort of speed and risk tolerance. So that was the next big challenge. And now we've sort of moved into the third set of really big challenges, which is developing great products, taking them to market, and introducing them to consumers, which is kind of the third wave, I'd say, of major challenges.
You're known as a company to focus on exotic meat. So what's the thinking there? Why not chicken or beef?
So there's a lot of different elements to this. It kind of comes back to the core I already mentioned, where if our goal is to create food that people that like eating meat will eat in the same occasions but choose selfishly because it offers something distinct, when you start to unpack what does distinct mean, it really means sensory experience, flavor, texture, nutritional profile. It means flavor and texture. It means nutritional profile. Does it have more protein, a better fat, sort of mix of fats, or other micronutrients which you care about, like iron? And it's also looking at things like sort of convenience and form factor, etc. There are two ways you can then approach creating those products. One is you can say, we're going to pick one species biology, like chicken, and we're going to try to make it work in cell culture, make it taste like chicken, and then look at adding a little bit of functionality, modifying, say, the fatty acid profile or something else to make it a little bit better. We took the opposite approach. We said, let's go and search through a really wide variety of species to find what's easy to grow cost effectively. And then let's treat those as ingredients that can be mixed together with other species to build up really unique sensory and nutritional profiles. And so that's why you see us looking outside of these conventional animals, because we don't want to be constrained by that really limited subset of biology. We want to view these as ingredients that can be used to create entirely new food experiences.
Now, we can't talk to you without mentioning the mammoth meatball. It's a story that broke the internet. I don't think any company in the all-protein sector generated more column inches than you guys last year. So what was the intention behind that? And were you at all concerned about how the overall industry would be perceived?
So the intention was to create a really large number of dinner table conversations for people to reconsider what do they want their meat to look like in the future. Ultimately, I do think we achieved that. It certainly had its fair share of controversy as well, which was the entire intent. I think the pleasant surprise was reading a lot of the comments online. There was a weirdly large number of people which were very aggressively defending what we had done, which was very strange because it was really a joke. None of us internally took it seriously at all. It was a really cynical kind of joke as a way of really getting that attention and starting that conversation. When it came to the pushback from other companies, I knew there was going to be pushback. In general, the world of alternative proteins, which I see VOW as being in a slightly different space, I view us very much as complementary and about adding to the diet of meat eaters. The world of alternative proteins has played it very, very safe with their comms, really focused on the systematic benefits. It's a more sustainable and ethical option, which is great, but that's ultimately not what consumers are buying. And so we also saw that as a key moment in sort of separating us from that existing theory of change around replacing the meat we eat today with the same thing made in a different way. And I do believe it achieved that. I don't think it was particularly helpful for us making friends with our peers along the way.
I mean, just out of interest, were there any specific advancements made in culturing meat using mammoth DNA?
I mean, it was more of a way, it was a project that we were doing as part of testing gene integrations. And so it helped us build up that toolkit, and it helped us verify that we can do so, both integrating a gene and then measuring the presence of the proteins produced by that gene reasonably effectively, which is a handy thing to be able to, or a handy capability for us to have. But it hasn't been a big part of our kind of core commercial R&D at this point.
Well, I mean, you certainly sparked discussion. So are there any specific misconceptions about cultivated meat that VOW is actively trying to dispel?
One of my big frustrations is the lab-grown moniker. The regulators that we've been working with have been very clear that by the fact we're produced in a factory, not a lab, we can't describe ourselves as lab-grown, which we obviously fully agree with. And so trying to sort of shake these simple labels that have stuck around has been a really big one. Mm-hmm. We use no genetic modification in anything that we are bringing to market or have already brought to market. And so the misconception that this is genetically modified food is another one we're very much trying to educate consumers and detractors about in particular. And then there's a lot swirling around about the environmental sustainability from what I'd describe as some really low quality life cycle assessments that were published in the last couple of years. Mm-hmm. So we're aiming to publish our own life cycle assessment later this year with all that process data included, so that there is an actual primary data source available for researchers to be building on, as opposed to assuming what the footprint would look like.
Now, you're an Australian company. You've got a big farming industry out there. So what are your thoughts about navigating the resistance from the traditional meat industry and farmers?
So in general, the resistance only comes if you're going to denigrate farming or try to compete with them in a very intentional way. Our entire approach, being complementary to the food that people that like eating meat eat, has really avoided a lot of that tension. Mm-hmm. That comes with a few commitments internally. The first is we very intentionally and very explicitly don't denigrate farmers or farming. There are good, sustainable ways to farm animals. It's very difficult to scale those, and that's pretty widely understood and widely agreed. And then the second is we don't make what farmers make. The entire intent of our product strategy and our entire company strategy is to offer foods you can't get any other way. Those two things together have avoided a lot of the tension which other companies have struggled with. And so far, it's been a fairly collegiate relationship. And I hope to continue that way.
Looking at the wider market around the world, there's a backlash against cultivated meat, or at least there certainly seems to be in certain European countries and in US states. How much of a concern is that for you? It seems that the walls are coming down in terms of regulations and technology, but other barriers are appearing.
I joke about this a little bit. I describe the perception in the US and US media in particular as being almost like Schrodinger's food, where simultaneously the sector is a failure when it comes to developing, scaling, and commercializing cultured meat as a product line, while at the same time it is this enormous threat to farmers' livelihoods. And often those two narratives are existing in the same media outlet around the same time. And it's almost like, which one is it? It's either a huge threat and a valid industrial sector, or the companies that are in the space have failed to scale even with the enormous amounts of capital they've raised. And so I don't think it's a meaningful threat. It's not based on any kind of risk. It's not based on any real risk. It's based purely on politics and trying to create an enemy where there isn't one. And I do suspect it will blow over and it won't end up being a substantial risk. By the time VOW is operating at any kind of meaningful scale where we want to be selling in those markets, I suspect it's probably going to be a non-issue by that point. But that really comes down to us and to other companies as well to be open, honest in our risk communications and incredibly, incredibly intentional about the food that we put, ensuring the absolute highest standards of both safety, quality, and integrity.
Now we're seeing some strategies being revised by some of the hitherto big boys in the cultivated meat sector. So what do you think's going on out there? We're seeing job cuts, we're seeing scaling plans being revised. What do you think's happening?
So, none of this is a surprise. The reason that I founded VOW now 5.5 years ago was because I looked at the strategy of those businesses and I said, I don't think this is going to work. I don't think this makes sense. And the reasons for that. One is everything I mentioned earlier. You're constraining yourself to a real subset of biology, and then you have to make that biology work to make the product that it comes from. So you have to make chicken cells taste like chicken meat, which is sort of constrained on both the inputs that you have access to and the outputs you can deliver with. That's a really big technical challenge. Even if you can overcome that, even if you can turn chicken cells into really, really tasty chicken meat, you're then competing in a commodity market against an industrialized and, at least in the US, essentially directly subsidized industry in meat producers that are buying subsidized crops. That's a really hard industry to compete with on any vector. And the one that you have to win on is price. You have to win on price almost immediately. It just didn't make sense to me that is a go-to-market. That is a go-to-market would ultimately lead to a positive impact. And so seeing this happen now, seeing these scaling plans bound back, seeing some of these job cuts, while it's really sad to watch from the outside, it's not a surprise. That entire commercial strategy was the reason I founded VOW, because I doubted it was going to have the impact that we needed to see in order to meet some of these emerging protein demands.
Mm-hmm. Now, given the cost of production and the lack of consumer market at the moment, the route to profitability for companies in this sector seems far from certain. So what makes VOW different when it comes to the business case? How are you going to turn a profit for your investors?
So there's a few things we're doing differently. The first is, at least from what I can see from other companies, we do have best-in-class costs at the moment, which has come through a lot of work around our scaling and around our process improvements. But the main way is we always set out to go to market with a luxury brand. We think about Forged, which is our luxury brand, as being the Tesla Roadster of cultured meat. It's something which is sold on the basis of novelty and exclusivity, not on the basis of similarity to what we already know. And the entire value proposition of Forged is experiencing foods you can't get any other way. And that's quite a unique offering in the market that we can charge a significant premium for. And when you do that, when you sort of change one side of that equation by putting the price up, by leaning into the distinctiveness, you simplify your product development challenges. You don't have to perfectly match anything that exists because distinctiveness becomes part of that value proposition. You're able to increase the price significantly, which means your cost down requirements in order to sell those products becomes a much lower bar needed to become unit profitable. So those are the two main approaches that we're taking. We're also doing a lot of work kind of outside our core business to expand the time that we have available to us through all sorts of other means. So there are a few other little bits and pieces we're doing on the side at the moment, which I unfortunately can't share.
Well, I think we originally had this interview planned a few months ago, and you said there was some exciting news on the horizon, and that exciting news was your clearance in Singapore and its availability in Singapore. So we'll come on to that in a minute. Technologically, it's widely accepted that we need breakthroughs in cells, bioreactors, and media to bring down the costs of cultivated meat. So how are you approaching cost reduction at Val?
So there's a few different levers. The way that I look at them, it's the biology in general, then it's the supply chain, then it's production systems. And so kind of going through those, we're doing a lot in the biology. We're mostly expanding our library of cells and available cell ingredients with new species, new cell lines, new derivatives of existing cell lines that are selected for higher performance. We're then taking those and we spent a lot of time last year optimizing our procurement and purchasing, especially for our media, as well as all the little bits and pieces of filters and seals and sort of consumables for the bioreactors to bring down our cost of goods through what goes into the process. And frankly, that is the biggest single lever when it comes to cost down. Better sourcing and better negotiating on those inputs is a really, really large cost down lever. And then the third is the production equipment design, which is probably where we're putting the biggest effort at the moment. We're fully vertically integrated when it comes to production. We design our own bioreactors. We have a team of welders on site that fabricates the vast majority of it outside of the tank. We have a software engineering team, which writes our process control software, on-site automation team, which does all the industrial automation, sort of integrating all the valves with the process control software and all the instrumentation as well. And so that's been a really big cost down lever because that really reduces your CapEx and it really simplifies the production equipment design in a really big way. That reduces your cost of procuring one of those production lines and it increases the reliability because you can't have a failure when there's no part to fail. So all of that together, sort of pulling all three of those levers at the same time, is how we think about achieving some of these really big and audacious cost down targets.
Now, you've already described how Val is all about making new foods rather than replicating what animals make. With cultivated meat, what possibilities exist for creating healthier and more sustainable protein sources that don't resemble traditional meat cuts?
So I think about this in sort of two ways. One is, what are the properties of nutrition that people go to meat for? And then the second way is, how could you then using cultured cells, create those same properties and turn them into a wide range of products. So when it comes to the properties that people go to meat for nutrition, broadly that's protein, iron, especially bioavailable iron, omega-3s from fish, and micronutrients, especially B vitamins, vitamin A, K, whatever else people kind of seek out meat for. So all of those sort of categories and targets that we look for, increasing the total protein, increasing the total iron, increasing the quality of fats and quality of certain types of fats like omega-3s. We then take those and we can turn them into any format. And so, yes, we can turn them into things that look like meat. We can also turn them into things like snack foods, whether that's more beef jerky or dried meat type format or something else entirely. That could also go into supplements. That could also become an ingredient in other foods. There's a lot of different ways that you can then start to integrate those cultured cells into our diets in a way which is either resembling the occasion or solving the problem of nutrition through a different format entirely. It's kind of a long-winded way of saying we sort of can do whatever we want.
That's the flexibility, I guess. So how do you envision cell-cultivated meat fitting into a future where we might redefine what meat is altogether?
So I think about this a lot through the formats that are really easy to integrate into our food. And so if you look at the types of formats and the types of meals, especially in a Western diet, minced burger sausages are a really common format that's very versatile. You can use them in a lot of maybe minced burger sausages, meatballs. You can use it across a really wide number of recipes and foods, both in your home and out of your home. And then broadly, fillets of things that can be sort of cut up and cooked and mixed into things, and then sort of steak and whole cuts is the kind of range of things that you want to, range of ways that you eat meat in recipes. What I see as the opportunity is for each of those categories, or each of those variations of meat, being able to have a wide range of sensory experiences and nutritional profile combinations. The example I often use is, 5 years from now, if it's a Tuesday night and I'm making some spaghetti bolognese and I walk into the supermarket and my decision is between beef, which is the same as it's always been, and a cultured meat option, which tastes better than beef, ideally, and it has the nutritional profile of salmon and is the same price or lower, and has extra protein. Of course, I'm going to choose the thing with the protein, the omega-3, that is really tasty, really cheap. That's a really easy decision. I expect that will be sold as a brand as opposed to an animal. I don't think you'll go and buy beef mince. I think you'll go and buy a branded food the way you would in the breakfast cereal aisle. So it's going to shift away from being this sort of commodity, simple transformation of a commodity like beef or chicken or pork, to being a branded economy like breakfast cereal or pretty much any other category of food.
That leads us nicely onto safety regulations and bringing food to market that consumers trust. So cultivated meat is a relatively new technology. How are you working with various regulatory bodies around the world to establish clear safety standards for production?
So we work with quite a few regulators at the same time. So over the last couple of years, what's public is we've been working with both the Singapore and Australia and New Zealand food regulator. There's other regulators we're engaging with, which is not public at this point. The first thing that we do is we bring in experts to evaluate and undertake our risk assessment with us, so that there are people which have a lot of expertise in food safety, food toxicology, microbiology, that are looking at the overall risk assessment really closely with us, with our team, to ensure that we are considering everything that matters. The second thing, we're extremely transparent with the regulators. We have had the Australian regulator visit us on 2 separate occasions, which is not part of their formal evaluation process. We've had the local enforcement agency, which is in Australia in Sydney, is New South Wales Food Authority, visit us now 2 or 3 times, I believe, to really understand the production process and how they would audit it. We proactively provide, in Singapore, every time I'm in town, I'll pop into the regulator and share some of the in-market data around serve size, volumes, customer feedback, demographics, etc., so that they can build an understanding of what's happening post-market and how does that match their risk assessment and risk models pre-market. And now we're starting to publish, or we will over the next 12 months, be publishing a lot of our risk assessments by working with academics, give them access to some of the data so that they can form a view and publish that in a peer-reviewed publication, to start to move this from what is a fairly private and sort of confidential relationship between us and the regulator to something which is public and transparent, so that anyone who's scientifically inclined and interested can go and dig in and look just look at the primary data themselves.
There's a lot of ways to build trust with both the regulators and the consumers. Now, building trust often requires collaboration. So in what ways are you guys partnering with chefs, nutritionists, or other stakeholders to champion cultivated meat?
So we work a lot with chefs at the moment. Given Forged as a brand, the value proposition is really just the value proposition of Forged is really just for food service. We really only want it to be in restaurants and hotels, or maybe really high-end airlines like first class in an airline. So we work a lot with chefs throughout the product development process. We bring chefs in for tastings frequently to give feedback. We're constantly working with chefs in Singapore, especially with chefs like Ryan Clift, who we've been working with over a very, very long period in order to both develop products, launch them, and gather feedback from his team, himself, as well as their customers. And we'll continue to do so. I think Ryan tasted probably 20 prototypes before we launched, variations of what we ended up launching with, as well as several products we didn't. Things like mince, a few different mince variations we tried. There was a quail mari, which was a quail with a calamari texture, and a whole bunch of other things that we sort of tested out but ultimately didn't launch or haven't launched yet, as a way of getting feedback and figuring out what actually makes sense in market.
So the product that you launched in Singapore, it's like a parfait. Is it called Qualia?
It's not. We just call it cultured Japanese quail parfait.
Right.
And then we also have the Japanese quail foie gras, which is sort of in testing with a couple of venues at the moment.
And what's the reaction been? Is that being served now in a restaurant in Singapore?
Yes.
And what's the
Yes.
reaction been to customers?
Yeah. So we're in 3 restaurants at the moment.
Mm-hmm.
We actually crossed over 1,000 serves this week, I think, over the last
Wow.
8 weeks. So it's so overall the reaction has been surprisingly, essentially universally positive, which is not what I expected. I thought it was going to be more divisive. Chefs are really pleased with the consistency of the products and being able to really limit their prep because it's ready to go. So that's all been very positive. And then, as I say, consumers have been universally positive, both on set menus as well as the menus was on the a la carte menu. We've seen a really good sell-through coming through, which has been very encouraging and exciting. Whilst this is early, it does seem like we're moving in the right direction.
Convenience factors very important for food service. Now, George, we're going to have a few final questions now. If you could look back on what you've achieved over the past 5.5 years or so, would you have done anything differently?
It's sort of hard to say. I think there's lots of things I would do differently with the benefit of hindsight, but each of them kind of built and taught us what we needed to do now. I think probably the biggest thing that I would change is I would go back and I would sort of commit to bringing up manufacturing earlier. It was something we only really started working on about 2 years ago in earnest, and has become a real strength for us. And I think that would have been a really good thing, a really good capability to start building a couple of years earlier. Would have driven some really good technical decisions early in our development process.
It's not a massive sector at the moment. I think it's probably about 180, maybe 200 players, probably in the entire value chain. What advice would you have for companies looking to get into the sector?
I think you need to offer something which is really distinctive. There's, over the last few years, especially on the input side, there's been a lot of companies which have been offering growth factors. It's a very hard choice for us as a business that's looking to provide products to customers to risk making ourselves reliant on emerging companies. So there needs to be such a huge value proposition of working with an emerging company as a supplier to us that it's too attractive to not take the risk. When it comes to products, companies trying to develop and scale products, I would say you really need to offer and have a credible pathway to unit profitability in just a few years, which is an extremely challenging thing to do with so much both technology, scaling, and regulatory risk. So being very selective about what opportunities make sense when you have all of those risks to navigate.
Well, George, I can only congratulate you on what you've achieved. You've come a long way, and you've achieved a lot with a relatively small amount of investment, given the sums of money that we've seen floating around the industry. Thank you very much for joining us, and we wish you all the luck in the future.
Thank you, Nick. Great to be here.